Hello, in this lecture I am going to tell you that whatever we have been doing so far, the way I narrated the history of social theory, the kind of sequence I built on is but one way of telling the story of sociology, and that there can be and should be multiple ways of telling the story that stem from different parts of the globe at different points in history. However, most undergraduate and graduate texts will follow a pretty similar narrative as I did in this course. This has come under challenge by many scholars who have written about what they call Southern theory, also referred to as theory from the global south, and many other terms in the same with the same idea. Let us look today at the work of Raven Collin and her book Southern Theory, in terms of what she argues and how she questions the canon that we have been studying so far. Raven Collin is an emeritus professor at the University of Sydney. She spent large part of her life in Sydney in the higher education institutions, but has also traveled widely and spent some time in the United States. She is very well versed with theories that are global as well as theories that claim to be the canon, or what we refer to as classical sociology. Now, in her biography, she writes that she's been teaching social theory, and her undergraduate, as a student, she's been studying social theory and was troubled by the fact that all social theory that she studied was coming from a context other than hers. Now, this is something that might be bothering you too, right? I mean, we are talking about Marx, and we are talking about Weber, and we are talking about Durkheim, all of them writing at in a space, in a geographical context of a historical time period of which we have no direct relationship, of which we have no experience ourselves. What about theories that emerge from our context? What about theories that emerge from our experience? So, these are the kind of questions Raven Collin has been asking. One of the primary things that defines her scholarship is the question, why is social theory dominated by Europe and North America, while the rest of the world appears largely as data? In order to answer this question, she initially publishes this paper in 1997, looking at the history of the canon, looking at the history of how certain texts came to be classical sociology, and then went on later in 2007 to publish the book that I had as the title slide in this particular presentation. So, in this paper, why is classical theory classical? She first defines the canon. She defines the canon as those privileged set of texts whose interpretation and reinterpretation defines a field. Now, how that comes to be, how a few texts get to be those canonical texts, is what she explores in this essay. She writes about the initial texts such as Weber, Durkheim, Comte, George Simmel, Marx, all of that, and she says that these are texts of the time period, but have little to do in the way they are theorizing with the way sociology or social science was actually being practiced on the ground. So, many of these texts have little to do with the practice of sociology, such as the ethnographic studies or the surveys that were ongoing. This is not to say that they don't build on some of those studies, but largely, just like most theory, they are also quite abstract and distant from the large amount of on-the-ground work that has been happening in sociology. So, what function do they serve? Like, why do we need a canon? Why do we have the idea of the classical sociological texts? Because this is unique to sociology in the social sciences. It is more like literary, the idea seems to be borrowed from the notion of a literary theory that has a canon in terms of literary theory, but most other social science disciplines such as geography or psychology have a few notions of founding fathers, but they don't quite have a classical geography or a classical psychology kind of notion. This is very much a sociological thing. What do they do is what she asks. She writes that they provide rituals of solidarity. So, they serve an integrative function for a discipline that finds itself in higher education at a certain point in history and had to therefore define itself in particular ways. She also points to this whole insistence that sociology has of founding fathers, like I said, which is not quite the norm in several other social science disciplines. Raven Connell defines the kind of theory that we know as classical sociological theory or classical social theory or the canon as metropolitan theory. She says all of this knowledge is emerging from the metropole, right? And at a time when empire, when colonialism was quite at its peak and has definitely influenced the kind of sociology that gets done. She writes, the birth of sociology cannot be understood by internalist models then, because it crucially involves the structure of world society. It can only be understood in geopolitical terms. Modern social science was formed in the context of empire and bears the marks of their origin. And all through this particular essay and her books, she shows how they bear the mark of their origin, including the work of Marx, for example, who drew a lot on the East India Company archives, including the work of Durkheim and his stages of history, Weber's notion of the various kinds of societies that he's studying in terms of religion, economy, and so on. So in all of this, she says they're drawing on material gathered from the colonial context. And another defining feature, she says, of the canon of the classical sociological texts is their strong belief in the idea of progress. Now, she writes that John Stuart Mill had cautioned against equating historical change with improvement as much back as 1843, and yet his student Comte has outlined the movement of history in the terms of progress or as a linear process of moving from one stage to the other. We also looked at the manifestation of it in Rostow's model of development, where society is moved from being underdeveloped to developed through particular stages in history. It was as if all countries in the world will have to go through the same stages of history, and some are here and some are here. Doreen Massey also writes about this when she says that how space has been converted into time, right? Some places are backward and some places are forward. Much of this has to do with the Darwinian notion of evolution being very much adopted and adapted by sociologists of their time, and therefore evolution found a huge home in the social sciences, even though it came from a biology discipline, but it was central to the way classical sociology developed. And you see that in Comte's work, where he divides the world into ancient, medieval, and modern. You see that in Hegel, the evolution of the spirit. You see that in Marx's, the sequence of modes of production and the way history moves forward. So you see that in Durkheim, you see that in Weber. So this sense of a progressive version, of a version of history that progresses from one stage to the other, has been a defining element of a lot of classical sociology texts, again drawing from Darwinian's idea of evolution. This particular idea of evolution, she says, and that social theory of its time presents, is a fiction, and it's a fiction that justifies itself by drawing from the ethnographic data, the vast reserves of ethnographic data that were gathered from the colonies. While it is drawing all the stages of history, idea and all of that from colonial archives, it is also, she argues, classical sociology is an internalist account, because most of the themes that they are concerned with are those class, of alienation, of industrialization, whereas other themes of race and gender and the colony itself are largely ignored. Through this process, metropole develops, which is the center, which has more advanced in terms of this narrative of progress, while there is the colonial other that is primitive. And this narrative then justifies the project of colonialism and imperialism, where even Marx, drawing on the East India archives, argues that India is a static society and it is the British that will bring dynamism and revolution to India, right? So very much, so she argues that sociology was very much embroiled in the project of colonialism and imperialism, and that it reflects the colonial relations, social relations of imperialism. Connell writes, sociology as a collective practice, that is to say, a set of institutions, a pedagogy, and a genre of writing developed in a specific social location among the men of the liberal bourgeoisie in the metropole. So it's not just the geographical and the historical context, but gender and race are also playing, and class are playing a huge role in who is getting to be the canon, right? Who is getting that place in the classical sociological texts. It is the men of the liberal bourgeoisie in the metropole. So I also should have mentioned that Raven Connell is one of the leading scholars and founder of the subdiscipline of masculinity studies, and has given us the concept of hegemonic masculinity, where she argues that there are many ways of being a man, and yet one notion of manhood is largely privileged, is largely the hegemonic masculinity that she talks about. Now that was a side, but I felt that her attention to gender and race are an important part of how she sees her work as a Southern theorist. I want to read out two more quotations that she has cited in her text, Southern Theory. I'll start with Kidd writing in 1898. The work undertaken by France in Algeria and Tunis, although it has differed in many important respects from that performed by Great Britain in India, and although it has been undoubtedly more directly inspired by the thought of immediate benefit to French interests, has been, on the whole, it must be frankly confessed, work done in the cause of civilization in general. So the idea that colonialism is actually a civilizing process, it's a civilizing project, it will lead to the progress of the world. This belief was so strong even amongst critical thinkers of their time. Then she quotes Giddings, who writes, objectively viewed, progress is an increasing intercourse, a multiplication of relationships, an advance in material well-being, a growth of population, and an evolution of rational conduct. It is a final display in the grand metamorphosis of universal evolution. So there is the universal idea and the evolution idea. The evolution idea I already spoke about, but we have spoken about this before, and what she's trying to emphasize here through Giddens is, while social theory emerges in a particular context, sociology emerges in a particular context, it has the pretense, as if it is the universal social theory and not a particularistic social theory. And it was not that there were no alternatives, like apart from Marx and George Simmel and Auguste Comte and Durkheim and Weber, there were several others writing around the time, and she names a few. So she talks about Oswald Spengler's work, Decline of the West, who argues that the history of the West has led to the decline of several ancient civilizations, and that he calls murder. So there was this theory also emerging at the same time, but it doesn't find a space in the canon. Similarly, Max Scheler and Karl Mannheim, Sociology of Knowledge, they also were writing around the time that the Frankfurt School is writing. Then in Russia, Nikolai Bukharin writes The System of Sociology. All of these questioning colonialism, all of these looking at the impact of imperialism and knowledge production. Then Du Bois, we've already spoken about, Race and Empire. And Gramsci also we've already spoken about, his theory of hegemony and the role of intellectuals. Now she says these alternatives never find a space as classical sociological texts, and that has largely to do with historical circumstance, right? So, for example, Max Scheler and Karl Mannheim had to flee Germany under Hitler, just like those of the Frankfurt School had to do. Bukharin was killed under Stalin. Gramsci, we know, was imprisoned under Mussolini. Du Bois never found an acceptance amongst the larger sociological peers of his, sociology peers of his time. Then Cornell talks about an epistemological break as the metropole, which was initially Europe, so largely we've spoken about France, Britain and Germany as the initial metropole, but then Russia and Italy emerging at some point. But then this metropole also shifts to the New World, to the United States. So now there is the European and the American context here. And America gets established as the new metropole. So there the narrative, she says, changes from social progress to social control, more like social order. So several ethnographic and empirical studies were done at that time to know how to control populations, how social order can be maintained, not so much on the fixation on social progress as it was with in the European context. So it is in United States when all of this is happening that the canon emerges in the shape that we know now. And this has a history. So firstly, it's important to also know that what we mean by the word canon. And she says canon in the English dictionary originally meant a rule or edict of the church. And this she finds kind of contradictory. You know, when you look at the work of Marx and you look at the work of Weber and Durkheim, they were challenging authority, they were questioning authority. I mean, look at Weber's work on power and authority, look at Marx's work on the class struggle. And by putting them into the canon, which means rule or edict, we are in fact doing injustice to the kind of critical work that the scholars of that time were doing. But like I said, this has a history. And one of it was the rising power of the United States. So the immense amount of wealth that was being gathered over there was making it an important interlocutor and an important voice in the way world history and the disciplinary histories were being written. Alongside was the establishment of mass education. Huge higher education system was being set up, departments of sociology were being set up in these large universities, and therefore teachers of sociology had to be trained. You know, curriculums had to be devised of what would we teach the sociology majors. Around the same time, in the 1950s, translations of many of the major works that were created in European languages had been accomplished by the 1950s. So they also were available to be canonized. Then Cornell shows how the formation of the canon actually this whole process lasts more than a generation and had two aspects to it. One was the canonical point of view itself. It wasn't the norm that every discipline will have a canon, but then this point of view was created with sociology because it also had to justify itself as a discipline, and in some ways having a canon enabled it to do so. And once this is being done, then there is also the job of the task of the selection of who would be the founding fathers. And it is not that this was a smooth process or a linear process, or it was already always decided that it would be Marx, Weber and Durkheim. Several scholars wrote around the time, several textbooks were published. There were the prominent ones that she names were by Parsons and C. Wright Mills. We've read C. Wright Mills in the early lectures in this course. Largely she shows how many texts didn't include all of them. So there would be other scholars, there would be Simmel maybe, there would be Comte. Weber and Durkheim were kind of constant. Marx was in and out. He was considered more like an influential person in the history of socialism, but maybe not enough or maybe too abstract to be considered a sociologist. But eventually he was also brought into the canon when particular textbooks became more popular or more significant than other ones. So that also played a role in how the canon was finalized. Through that process also emerges what she calls a textbook cliché. We know of the conflict theorists and we know of the consensual theorists. So conflict theorists are, let's say, Marx, who talks about the conflict in society between the social classes, And we know that Durkheim was looking for consensus. He was looking for social order. He was looking for what is the glue that holds sociology together. And so Marx was fitted into this canon by creating this division between the conflict view and the consensual view. And this way of reading sociology, this way of reading the canon has almost become a textbook cliche. Then she quotes Engels, who writes, "There are 4 men, however, whom everyone in sociology, regardless of his special emphasis, bias or bent, will probably accept as the central figure in the development of modern sociology." Quite a telling statement. I mean, one, there are 4 men, and interestingly though, in this Engels list, you have Comte and you have Weber and Durkheim, but you don't have Marx. So it's a different set of 4 men. I want to take a few minutes to look at some of the alternatives that Raven Connell lists in her book Southern Theory. There are several, but I'm going to talk about just 2 in the interest of time. And one of them is Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon is writing around the time of the Algerian War of Independence, and his theory is about colonialism, right? His theory is about what colonialism does to both the colonized and the colonizer, to both these societies. And he says colonialism as a structure shapes identity, so how the colonizer or the colonized see themselves in relation to the other. And it shapes space by creating these binaries of the colonizer space, the white town, and the colonized space, the black town. And with both of these spaces offering very different experiences of everyday life. It shapes psychology, and this is kind of similar to what Du Bois argued on how the colonized views themselves through the lens of the colonizer, right? So there is a split in the identity of the colonized, where there is the internal self and then the one that is responding to the colonizer and is viewing through the themselves through the colonizer's gaze. And then power and violence are being reshaped through the colonial and the social relations, right? And in that, he says the impact of colonization is so strong that even the national bourgeoisie, which might actually even be fighting for the nation's independence, is incapable of great ideas or inventiveness, because their whole worldview has been shaped through the colonial experience. And we know this through our own experience in the Indian context of how Macaulay's notion of creating that set of people who would be Indian in the way they look, but British in the way they think, right? So that was the kind of education that they brought into India, and how that has shaped generations of post-colonial Indians. The next scholar that I wish to touch upon from Connell's book is Samir Amin. And Samir Amin is a hugely influential scholar and has given us what we know as dependency theory. Dependency theory looks at the world, I'll just read out this bit. Dependency theory looks at the world capitalist system as polarized between a developed center and an underdeveloped periphery. Accumulation on a world scale reproduces the inequality between centers and peripheries. The development of the center and underdevelopment of the periphery are 2 sides of the same historical process. So this is a huge challenge to that model of progress, right? To showing something as underdeveloped and something as developed. Development is possible because there is extraction of resources from elsewhere which is being kept underdeveloped. So there is a direct social and a geopolitical relationship between that which is looked at as underdeveloped and that which is looked at as developed. And that they are part of the same historical process. So it is not a stage theory, it is an interrelational theory, right, that he is trying to have us see. Now this theory could have also become the canon, but it didn't. And that is the kind of approach to the geopolitics of knowledge that Connell wants us to see. Now Samir Amin has also talked about delinking in the 1980s, and it's a slightly controversial idea. he talks about delinking does not mean autarky. It means the subordination of external relations to the logic of internal development. So, in fact, this has been a hugely influential theory in the way several countries chose their developmental trajectories in terms of closing in for some time, allowing internal industry to develop and then opening up the economy. India did that to some extent, South Korea did that to some extent in the early years, where their particular economy or the industry is in infancy, you don't allow an external influence, and then eventually you open it up to global trade. Immanuel Wallerstein's world system theory, which divides the world into periphery, semi-periphery and the core, also builds upon Samir Amin, and they were working in the same institution. And in this theory, he shows how the core is dependent on the semi-periphery, you can look at it as the developed, the developing and the underdeveloped world, right. So, this notion of relationality that he shows in the world systems theory, building upon Samir Amin's work, looks at how the world is interrelated, how the world is a system where one kind of state, either a core state or a semi-peripheral state, depends on another kind of state for its own progress and development. Samir Amin has also, similar to Connell, written about Eurocentrism. He writes, Western intellectual traditions often portray Europe as the natural center of world history. This is the concept that Southern theory wants to dismantle. This looking at the world with Europe as the center. There can be many views of looking at the world. We could look at the world from the global south, we could look at the world from India, we could look at the world from Australia, we could look at the world from Latin America, from other parts of Asia, from Africa, and maybe it would in fact look different from all these different perspectives. But for the longest time, we have held Europe to be the center, and that the way Europe experienced modernity to be the only pathway towards historical development. So, to summarize, Southern theory asks us to expand the canon and actually work towards building a world social science. So, again, here the point about looking from elsewhere, looking from different places and building a global canon, including scholars from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, from Australia, and therefore building a more complete canon rather than telling a very minuscule part of the history of sociology from a very small part of the globe. Theory emerges from particular historical and geographical contexts, and this bit we need to be cognizant of even as we read what is labeled as classical sociological theory or the canon of the discipline of sociology. So, we need to rethink the idea of universality. All theory is particular, right? All theory emerges from a historical context, all theory emerges from a particular place. We need to think of multiple trajectories, we need to think of multiple directions for the flow of theory. For example, it has been usually the case that the empirical data comes from the global south, whereas the work of abstraction, the work of theory building happens in the west. Connell argues for these flows to be opened up. For example, there can be theory that can be coming out, there is theory that is coming out of the global south, there is theory coming out of the experiences of the global south, and that we need to privilege these theories as much as we privilege theory coming from Europe. With that, I'll end this class and see you next class. Thank you.